Welcome to the Osteoclast examination series with Ric Angliss, and we're talking about today the way that the examination is interpreted on the back end. So how is your performance assessed and how does it all get put into one system whereby the outcome is you being reported as successful or unsuccessful. Thank you, Ric, for joining us.
Thank you. Just as a general thing, I wouldn't get too worried about how the marking process happens. Certainly as the candidate, that's not something that's in your purview, so worrying about something you can't change is the best way of worrying about the marking is to do a good performance. But having said that, each segment of the exam, the 7 segments of the exam.
So what are they, just to run through again?
So run through those. Written paper 1, written paper 2.
So the essay and the ISOR is one section?
One section.
Okay.
Yep.
And given one mark.
And we can talk about that if you like. But both of the writtens and then all 5 of the Vivas are marked as a consensus mark between the 2 examiners out of 4. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4. A 4 is an exceptional performance. A 3 is a performance above the standard that's required. A 2 is a performance below the standard that's required. And a 1 is well below the standard that's required. And that marking system is called the closed marking system. In years gone by, many years ago, it used to be 8, 8.5, 9, 9.
Yeah, I've had people tell me, I'll make sure you have to say this, and this to get a 9.
Yeah.
What's a
what
9
the hell's
mean?
a 9? Yeah, so that was all a bit confusing, and we had half points and all the rest.
And is that score 1, 2, 3, or 4? Is that a vibe, or have you got a very specific checklist of things that we have to say to get the 4 or to get the 3 or?
So it's not an OSCE, so there are no checklists. So it really is relying on very senior people who are very experienced in assessment to look at that, to know that standard and to apply that standard. Now the standard of the exam is that everyone who's sitting for the exam, who's been signed off to sit the exam, we would expect them to be at a passing standard. So we're not trying to fail people, we're trying to pass people. We're trying to allow people the opportunity to show us that they're ready. And we're very receptive and very sympathetic to that. But if someone isn't ready, then there's a very big responsibility on the examiners not to pass somebody who hasn't met the standard. And that standard setting is a very big part of what we do, and it's a big part of how we, each examiner has to go through a pre-examination course before they're allowed to examine. So there's a lot of stuff that goes in behind this that the candidates don't see. And
do the 2 examiners give you one number together, or do they give you their own numbers and they have to agree or disagree, or what do they?
So that it seems very confusing from the outside. So for every question you're asked, so every case scenario, question 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the op surge, each examiner will come up with their own mark without discussion. And that's committed to paper without discussion. At the end of the exam, at the end of that segment, as the candidate leaves the room, the examiners then discuss each of the questions, and they don't have to come up with an agreed number for each question, but they have to come up with an agreed number for the whole segment.
For that candidate.
From
the 2 examiners.
From the 2 streams. Now they're all recorded, they're all put onto a graphic representation that we all see in the discussion and decision making meeting. But the most important number is that consensus mark for the whole segment. So you end up with 7 marks for 7 segments. If that if the aggregate of those marks is 21 or more, then the convention is that's a pass.
So that's basically an average of 3.
Average of 3.
Over the 7 stations.
Yeah. So if you're a low-level bomber who just flies in under the radar and gets 3 for every section, to use Angus Gray's analogy, then that's a pass. If you get a 4 for every section and you end up with 28, never seen that, but if you end up with that, then you no more pass than the person who got 21.
Yep.
And there are no medals for who got the most. It's just the pass or
binary.
Not. So on the other end of the scale, if your aggregate is 18 or less, then that would be accepted as a failing mark. And every candidate can be discussed. So we put up the marks and there's a vote about, you know, do we accept that all these 18s and less have not passed the exam. But if someone says, well, hang on, the way that looks on this sheet, I'm not really happy about that, I want to discuss that candidate, then that's absolutely fine as well.
Okay.
So the 19s and 20s get discussed, and they're discussed in great detail. And what the discussion is actually doing, without you know, labouring the point too much, you're looking at where the deficiency was. What was the reason that they didn't get across the line in one section? And then we're going through the whole of the rest of the exam looking for compensatory performance. So if you've mucked up a knee replacement question, but you've done really well in 2 other knee replacement questions, that can actually be very strong mitigation to get somebody across the line.
Okay. And so I guess you're looking for a 3 on average, but you can have 19 or 20, so you could have 3s and 2 2s, for example, and then you're discussed.
Yep.
Okay. And just to clarify, so for op surge, for example, I've got 5 different operative cases that are discussed. I'm actually getting 1 score for the whole lot.
Yeah.
So I might do well in some, poorly in others, but I still might get a 3
Absolutely.
overall. So it's not even just the specific case, it's actually the whole half an hour or 35-minute session that I'm getting in one single number
One
for.
single number
Number
for,
2.
which is actually works to the candidate's favour, because if you've dropped 1 or 2 questions, you haven't done well in the first question and the third question, but you've done a very standard good performance in the other 3, you're going to get through that segment.
Okay, so it's probably...
So you can afford to say some silly things. You can afford to have some questions where you're not as strong as others. You don't want them, but you can afford
But it's not a
them.
write-off, and you shouldn't, I guess...
That's right, and that goes back to that comment that was made in the previous segment about not carrying the previous question into the next question and not
Because it might not
worrying
actually
about
matter that much if you've
absolutely
completely bombed 1 question out of the 5 in a half an hour session.
Yeah,
you can still pass the whole session.
and you can imagine, you know, with the number of years I've been doing this, you see all sorts of performances, and the one that breaks your heart the most is the person who feels that they haven't done well in the first question, and you can see that eating at them all the way through, and it's almost a cascading decrease in performance as the exam goes through. And it may be somebody who really knows what they're doing, but they've just allowed that self-doubt to affect every aspect of what they're saying.
Which is a hard thing to manage.
It's so hard, and that's why I'd say try and do questions on end. So you're backing up one question with another,
Yep.
and practice that as well. But you know, the bottom line is the examiners are trying to pass. You know, they're trying to see merit in the performance that allows them to assess that as being to the standard or above.
So the clarity, I guess, is there for the clinical and the op-surge, the Viva type stations. What I guess, and probably like you said, doesn't matter too much, but I don't understand the marking system for the written exams. In particular, a lot of people told me, well, you know, the MCQs are normalised, so people have to fail. Is that true, and what does that mean, and are there any other sections that are run like that?
So that is true. The only section that runs with a marking to a mean and standard deviation is the multi-choice. And just very briefly, for every sitting cohort, a mean of number of correct responses is calculated, and a standard deviation. And if you're a standard deviation above or below the mean, that's a 3. That's a standard performance. If you're more than a standard deviation above the mean, then that's a 4.
Okay.
That's a very good performance.
Okay.
If you're less than a standard deviation, if you're more than a standard deviation below, then that's 2. So if you do your statistics, that means that there will be people in that cohort. And if you're more than 2 standard deviations below the mean, that's a 1, and that's not a common thing to see.
Okay.
So yes, that it's true that some people will fail, and yes, it is true that there's some statistics that involves that, but that's true of all multi-choice exams, pretty much.
What about the ISAWs and the
So
essay?
the written paper 2 is very different. Written paper 2 we've had to come up with a model, and this is way before my time, but we have to come up with a model that allows us to mark essays, and each essay is marked 1 to 4, and then mark eyesores, and then each eyesore is marked true or false. Pass or fail.
Okay.
So you've got a 3 and a 3 for your essays, and you've got 6 out of 10 right for your eyesores, and that all feeds into a grid matrix that's been used forever, and comes out with a mark there. So
it's a single mark, 1 number out of 4.
1 mark out of 4. So, but the consensus aspect of it is the final mark for each essay. So I should say that essay 1, essay 2 are marked by different pairs of examiners.
Okay.
And then a different pair of examiner again marks eyesores 1 to 5, and a different pair again mark eyesores 6 to 10.
So there are 8 examiners looking at my written paper too.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
That's
And during COVID, when we were in hubs, the added thing was we had to make sure that all of the writtens were marked by people outside your state, to try and minimise the biases and all that sort of stuff. So a lot of back end, organisation goes into all of that. But that gives you this mark that goes into a grid that then comes into the final consensus mark. And every court does that. So some courts have 25 short answers and you've got to get more than 16 to get a pass or something of that nature. Some of the courts even have a situation where if your number of marking points aren't enough, you get a 1. Now, we don't do that. For us, a 1 is an answer that is very much below standard. We don't do mathematical consensus marking.
Well, I guess the take-home message there for me that was that your mark, in particular for the oral examinations, is an impression. It's not that you can fail because you didn't mention this tick box one thing.
Yeah, it's
not
not
an overall impression of your whole session with those 2 examiners, and they both come up with a consensus for a mark.
And if you look through the literature, Angus Gray's done a lot of work on this. If you look through the literature on higher order exams, higher level exams, high stakes, the best systems are based on that. They're based on experienced assessors saying, are you ready or not? I mean, you look at the American board exams, they're post-graduation, but you go before a board and all your cases are discussed. And they come up with an impression about whether you're safe or not safe. There's no OSCE type marking.
Yep.
Lower stakes exams, medical students, exit exams from that in a lower stakes sort of setting, the OSCE system, checkbox marking is not unreasonable.
Okay.
And in some respects you're compromising standardisation for excellence and standard.
Well, I think it's a very good summary of the marking, and that gives us a lot of insight. And that's something that I think you don't really get much of.
But I would just reiterate that the mechanism of the marking is not something that you can change, that you can play to. There's no trick or tip to give you an edge in the marking process. I've had plenty of candidates over the years who've rung me and said, now how do they mark this and what's that all about? And my advice is always forget about that. Concentrate on your best performance, understanding your orthopaedics, and on the day. And if you go in there and every segment you perform to the best of your ability and you're a 3 or a 4, the marking's irrelevant.
And I think unfortunately some people see that marking of the multi-choice exam as a reason not to pull each other along in the preparation for the multi-choice. Do you have any advice on how that might be perceived and interpreted?
Yeah, I strongly feel that life is about helping people, and I think that if you go into a process like this thinking that to help somebody else is to your own detriment, philosophically I find that against all the principles of what we want to have to select a surgeon. It's all about teamwork and compassion and empathy, and the better you can make the people around you who are helping you with your exam, the better you're going to be. Yep. Every candidate's going to have an area where they're a bit weaker, and a really good study group helps to lift everyone to a much better standard, and gives your own study group a much better chance of passing. So even if, you know, 1 or 2 or 3 people have to fail MCQ, if the only thing that you fail in the whole exam is your MCQ, it's very likely you're not going to fail the exam. And so you're not actually working against yourself by helping other people along.
I think it's a good insight. So thank you, Ric, for that session on the back end, I guess, of the interpretation of your performance and the examination days.